There's a specific kind of hurt that comes not from hatred, but from indifference. When someone you genuinely like looked right through you as if you were furniture, as if the conversations you had, the moments you shared, never actually registered. That's the kind of hurt Hudson Chin carried. Her name was Vivian, and in the world Hudson moved through, a world of cheap rent, shared meals, and thrift store finds, she was something else entirely. She came from money the way some people come from a country. It shaped everything about her, the way she moved, the places she went, the way she barely noticed who wasn't in her orbit. Hudson had liked her, genuinely, quietly, the way he did most things, without performance, without agenda. They'd been thrown together at a mutual friend's birthday gathering, and for one evening, she had actually talked to him. Laughed at something he said. Asked about his life. He'd thought it meant something. He'd reached out afterward. A message, casual, nothing desperate. Then another, a few days later. Then silence on his end, waiting. She had seen them. The little receipt sat there like a small stone thrown through glass. She never replied. Not once. Not an apology, not a brush off, just nothing. He ran into her twice after that at social gatherings. Both times, she looked past him. Not rudely, that would have almost been better. Just casually, as if his face wasn't something her brain bothered to store. He made a quiet decision then. If he didn't exist in her world, she wouldn't exist in his. That was 6 months ago. Since then, Hudson had rebuilt. Not dramatically, not loudly, just steadily. He leaned into his friendships, saved a little money, found routines that felt good. His mornings smelled like coffee and the distant sound of Kibben always being 20 minutes late to everything. Ethan was the anchor of their group, tall, always put together in his white button-up and black pants, silver watch catching the light. He worked at a logistics company by day and cooked for the group on weekends as if feeding people was the most natural form of love. Which, for him, it was. Julian was the noise and Julian was the joy. He was a mechanic by trade and by soul, always arriving with grease on his jacket sleeve and a story that began with, "Okay, so you're not going to believe this." His curly hair bounced when he laughed, which was often, and his laugh made everyone else do the same. And then there was Jameson, who had agreed to be at this very meal and was, predictably, not here. His chair sat empty. His text had come in 40 minutes ago, on my way. They'd stopped being surprised years ago. Jameson's absence had become its own kind of presence. It was a normal Tuesday. The kind of Tuesday that had no business being anything other than forgettable. They were eating K-barbecue because Kibben had lobbied for it for 3 weeks straight and everyone had finally surrendered, and the meat was sizzling, and the conversation was easy. Normal. Good. Then the door opened. Hudson didn't look up at first. He was flipping a piece of pork belly, but he heard Julian's voice go just slightly flat, and that was always a signal. Julian going flat meant something was happening that required adult processing. Hudson looked up. Vivian walked in like she always did, as if the room had been waiting for her. She was with Sanskriti and Giselle. Daniela was apparently still on her way because Giselle kept checking the door. The hostess was already moving to accommodate them. Of course she was. Hudson turned back to the grill. His jaw was set but his hands were steady. He had spent months learning that indifference was a muscle, and he had worked it hard. He would eat his food and not look at her and it would be fine. It would absolutely be fine. He almost made it. They were on dessert, shaved ice, because Julian had produced a coupon, when he heard her voice. Not directed at him, just in the air. It crossed the room the way voices sometimes do, familiar and unwanted, landing right in the center of his chest. And then, because the universe apparently had an agenda, their eyes met. Just for a half second. He hadn't meant to look. She had. When their gaze connected, something crossed her expression that Hudson couldn't quite categorize. Not guilt exactly. Something more complicated. He looked away first. Always away. Ethan watched the exchange with the patience of someone who had heard the full story. He didn't say anything. He just topped up Hudson's glass of water, which was Ethan's version of saying, "I see you and you're okay." Hudson appreciated it more than he could have put into words. Across the restaurant, Sanskriti had noticed Ethan. She had, in fact, been noticing Ethan since the moment they'd walked in. She didn't say anything, she never did, she was too composed for that, but her gaze tracked him with the particular helplessness of someone who has fully accepted that they have a crush and can do nothing about it. They left before Vivian's group did. Hudson paid his share, pulled on his jacket, and kept his eyes forward. He didn't look back at her table. He was proud of that. He was also, quietly, annoyed that he had to be proud of something that simple. That looking away from a girl in a restaurant felt like an accomplishment. Outside, Julian was mid-story about a car he'd fixed that day with a paperclip and sheer confidence. Kibben had both earbuds in now and was nodding vaguely at approximately 40% of the conversation. Hudson walked alongside them and let the noise of his friends wash over him like warm water. This was home. 3 days later, Hudson got a message from a number he didn't recognize. "Hey, I think we have mutual friends. This is Vivian. I was wondering if you'd want to grab coffee sometime." He read it twice. Then he set his phone face down on the table and stared at the ceiling for a long time. He didn't reply. He screenshotted it and sent it to the group chat instead. Julian's response was a series of increasingly dramatic emojis. Kibben replied, lol, 12 minutes later, suggesting he'd only just seen it. Ethan sent back a simple, your call. Whatever you decide, we're here. That was the one that stayed with him. He did not reply to Vivian. A week passed, then another. He figured that would be the end of it. She'd gotten curious, made an impulsive gesture, he'd ignored it, she'd move on. That was the natural order. Rich girls with long dark hair and designer bags did not persist. They moved on to the next thing. He was wrong. The next message arrived on a Thursday morning. I know you probably don't owe me anything. I just thought maybe we could start fresh. No pressure. He read it, set his phone down again, picked it back up, read it again, set it down. He still didn't reply, but he noticed something that annoyed him. Her second message was better than her first. More self-aware, less entitled. He filed that observation away under irrelevant and went to make coffee. The coffee did not fully erase the thought. The third message came 2 days later. This one wasn't a text. It was a voicemail. He stared at the notification for a full 20 seconds. Then, entirely against his better judgment, he pressed play. Her voice was different from how he remembered, quieter, less composed. She said, I think I owe you an apology. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I wasn't paying attention. And I should have been. He deleted the voicemail. Then he sat down and thought about what it meant that she had left it. Not a text, a voicemail. Voices were harder to fake. Voices cracked in places text couldn't. He thought about that for an hour and then firmly decided it didn't matter and went on a run, which he almost never did. Meanwhile, across the city in a penthouse apartment that Hudson had never seen and would have raised an eyebrow at, Vivian was having a different kind of morning. She sat at her window with her phone in her hands, looking out at the skyline, and tried to understand what exactly had happened to her. Sanskriti found her there. She set a cup of tea down on the sill and studied her friend with the accuracy of someone who had known her for a decade. You actually like him, she said. Not a question. Vivian didn't deny it. She just turned the phone over in her hands and said, he's not going to talk to me. So make it so he has to, Giselle said from the kitchen doorway, appearing with a croissant, entirely unbothered. She was always late to things but somehow always on time to say the exact thing that broke a situation open. You have resources, Viv. Use them. Vivian looked at her. Something behind her eyes shifted. The plan, such as it was, began with coincidence engineering. Vivian had a friend on the board of a community arts center that needed volunteers. Hudson, she had learned through Sanskriti, who had learned through Ethan, did volunteer work there on Saturday mornings. It was almost elegant. Almost. Hudson saw her at the sign-in table. His hand stopped mid-reach for the volunteer sheet. Vivian looked up from the clipboard. The coordinator between them said something cheerful about being so glad the new volunteer had come in today. Hudson's brain read a very quick calculation and arrived at the same conclusion 3 times. She gave him a small, almost apologetic smile. He looked at the coordinator, looked at the clipboard, signed his name, and then walked to the opposite side of the room. He helped a group of kids with a collage project and spoke to Vivian exactly 0 times for the entirety of those 3 hours. He left 5 minutes before the shift ended. In the parking lot, walking fast toward the bus stop, he heard her behind him. Hudson, his name in her voice. He kept walking. I know what you're doing and I understand it, she said, louder now, matching his pace from a distance. I wanted you to know I'm not going anywhere. He didn't look back. He got on the bus, found a window seat, and pressed his forehead against the glass as the city moved past. His heart was beating faster than a 3-hour arts and crafts shift warranted. He knew that. He was choosing not to analyze it. He told Ethan about it that night while Ethan made pasta. Ethan listened the whole time without interrupting, which was one of his best qualities. When Hudson finished, Ethan plated the food, set a bowl in front of him, and said, What did you feel when you heard her voice? Hudson said, Nothing. Ethan said, Okay. Ethan's, okay, was not a dismissal. It was a knowing one. It meant, I'll wait. Hudson ate his pasta and didn't say anything else about it. Kibben showed up 40 minutes later, because apparently he'd been invited to dinner too, just hadn't mentioned it, and immediately asked what they were watching because he wanted to put something on. The following week brought the second act of Vivian's campaign. She had purchased a small table at a charity gala, a legitimate one, a cause she actually cared about, and through the event's volunteer coordination program, Hudson's Arts Center was invited to send representatives. His coordinator asked him personally. He said yes before he knew the full context. Julian was delighted. A gala? With rich people and little food on big plates? He started improvising an aristocratic accent that was neither British nor French but somehow both. Jameson said he was absolutely coming, 100%, wouldn't miss it. No one believed him. They were right. The gala was held at a hotel downtown with ceilings so high they seemed to belong to a different kind of atmosphere. Hudson arrived in the best version of his usual self, a crisp white-collared shirt instead of his standard tee, the same dark jeans but the clean pair, his least scuffed sneakers. He looked like himself. He decided that mattered. Ethan had also come. The Arts Center had given them 2 spots. He stood beside Hudson in his standard white button-up and black pants and looked, paradoxically, more at ease than most people in the room. His posture and his silver watch and the quiet way he held himself suggested a confidence that had nothing to do with wealth. Several people assumed he worked there. Vivian was at the center of the room, shaking hands with a city council member, laughing at something someone said with the practiced ease of someone raised to make rooms feel comfortable. She was in a dark navy dress, hair down in loose waves, simple gold earrings. She looked extraordinary and she knew it, and she still scanned the room for Hudson within 60 seconds of arriving. She found him at the arts table near the far wall. He was explaining one of the kids' projects to an older couple who looked genuinely interested. He was animated in the way he got when he was talking about something he actually cared about, his hands moving slightly, his smile real. She watched for a moment before making her way over. She came up beside him just after the couple moved on. "You're good at that," she said quietly. He turned. His expression reset from warm to carefully neutral in about a quarter second. "At what?" he said. Not quite a question. "Talking about things that matter," she said. "Making people care about them." He didn't respond to that. He asked her, with the precise politeness of someone building a wall one brick at a time, what her involvement with the event was. She told him. He nodded. She asked about the arts center. He told her just enough. They spoke for 4 minutes. It was the longest 4 minutes of either of their evenings. Ethan, from across the room, witnessed the entire exchange. And something else witnessed it too. Across the same room, in a small cluster near the bar, Sanskriti had noticed Ethan watching, and watched him watching, and quietly tucked that observation somewhere close to her heart. Hudson extracted himself from the conversation with a clean, polite excuse. Someone needed him at the table, and walked away. He didn't look back. He was getting very good at not looking back. He was less good at what happened internally each time he did it, which was an argument he refused to let come to any resolution. He told himself the conversation hadn't meant anything. He repeated this on the bus home. He repeated it while brushing his teeth. He was repeating it in bed when his phone lit up with a text. "Thank you for being civil tonight. I know you didn't have to be." He did not repeat the thing after that. He just stared at the text. The next morning he was at the cafe near his apartment, his place, his routine, when Daniela appeared at the counter beside him to order. He recognized her as one of Vivian's friends. She introduced herself without fanfare, ordered a cortado, and said, entirely casually, "She really does feel bad about how things went. Just so you know, you don't have to do anything about it." He looked at Daniela. She met his gaze with the kind of honesty that wasn't trying to sell him anything. "I'm not a messenger," she said. "I'm just getting coffee. But you're here and I thought I should say it." Then she took her cortado and found a table by the window and opened a book. Hudson stared at his coffee. The coffee stared back. He went to the group chat. He typed, "She's sending people now." Julian replied immediately with 3 laughing emojis and, "She's literally deploying forces, bro." Kibben replied 40 minutes later, "Who is?" Ethan replied, "How do you feel about it?" Hudson closed the app without answering. He answered it in his head for the rest of the day. The answer, if he'd been honest, was complicated. He felt something that wasn't quite softening but wasn't hardness either. It was something more like curiosity, the dangerous kind, the kind that asks questions it already suspects the answer to. He hated the feeling. He understood it. Both things were true. The pivot came not from Vivian but from money, as pivots in stories involving wealthy families often do. Her father, Desmond Cho, had decided to expand his philanthropic foundation into youth arts programming. He needed a community partner. The city's arts center, Hudson's Arts Center, was at the top of the shortlist. This meant that a meeting was being arranged. A real one, with coordinators and agendas and funding numbers. And the person Vivian's father said to liaise with the Arts Center's volunteer representatives, because they wanted ground-level perspectives, he said, was Vivian herself. She had not engineered this one. It had arrived in her lap and she had accepted it like the answer to a question. When the coordinator told Hudson he'd been selected as one of the volunteer reps for a partnership meeting, she specifically mentioned that the Cho Family Foundation was involved. He heard the name. He absorbed the connection. He looked at the coordinator and said, "Is this meeting actually real?" She said, "Very real. There's $50,000 on the table." He showed up to the meeting in his white t-shirt and dark jeans because he refused to perform for anyone, and because Ethan had said, "Go as yourself. If the money requires a costume, it's the wrong money." The conference room was at a hotel. It had a view. It had sparkling water. Vivian was already seated when he arrived. She greeted him with professional warmth that was also unmistakably personal. He greeted her the same way. They both knew what was happening. The coordinator and the foundation's other representative did not, and the meeting proceeded around this invisible architecture as both of them performed competence at its highest level. He had not expected her to be good at this. That was his miscalculation. She asked the right questions. She pushed on numbers that seemed inflated. She argued for expanded programming rather than scaled-back pilots. She was sharp and prepared and genuinely invested, and it was harder to hate someone when they were clearly fighting for the same thing you were. When the meeting wrapped, the foundation representative stepped out to take a call. The coordinator excused herself for a moment, and Hudson and Vivian were sitting at the conference table alone together for the first time, No crowd to blend into, no project to hide behind, no graceful exit available. You're not going to make this easy, are you? She said. It wasn't an accusation. He looked at her directly. Why should I? She met his gaze. You shouldn't, she said. I didn't make anything easy for you. It was the most honest thing anyone had said in that room all day. He didn't respond. He put the cap back on his pen, gathered his copy of the documents and stood. But before he made it to the door, he stopped. He didn't turn around. He said, quietly, the voicemail. What you said about not paying attention. I heard it. Then he left. She sat very still in the empty conference room. The funding partnership was approved, which meant, by the logical architecture of the world, that Vivian and Hudson would be in the same space again. And again. The Arts Center's new programming launched with a kickoff event, and Vivian's involvement as the foundation liaison meant she would be present for every major milestone. Hudson watched this development with a feeling he could only describe as helpless inevitability. Every wall he'd built, the silence, the avoidance, the careful distance, the universe appeared to be quietly dismantling them one structural decision at a time, and he couldn't fight it without also fighting the work he loved. Julian was predictably enthusiastic about the whole situation. Bro, he said, from underneath the car he was fixing at the garage, voice echoing slightly on steel. She literally funded the thing you love just to be near you. That's either terrifying or the most romantic thing I've ever heard, and I'm choosing romantic. Hudson said, you're choosing wrong. Ethan's view was more measured. They were at the park one Saturday morning. A routine walk they developed years ago when everyone's schedule was so different that weekend mornings were the only real estate they all shared. She's not playing anymore, Ethan said. Whatever she was before, this is different. Hudson looked at the ground. I know, he said. What Hudson hadn't told any of them, not Ethan, not Julian, not even himself fully, was that he had started watching for her. Not hoping, not wanting to, just noting involuntarily when she was in a room and when she wasn't. His brain had begun filing her as significant information, and he hated it, and he kept showing up to things anyway. The tension between their worlds also had a social life now. Vivian's friends began appearing at events, which meant Ethan and Sanskriti were occupying the same space with increasing frequency, and the particular electricity between them, both of them too aware of the other, neither of them doing anything about it, was becoming its own subplot. Hudson noticed it. Of course he noticed it. He nudged Ethan once, nodded in Sanskriti's direction. Ethan looked, and looked away immediately with the particular discipline of someone who has decided not to want something. Hudson understood that feeling so well it almost made him laugh. Almost. Giselle arrived at the event 40 minutes late, not a surprise, and immediately found Daniela and began narrating everything she'd missed. Daniela, who had already catalogued the Ethan-Sanskriti situation, the Hudson-Vivian proximity, and the general emotional weather of the room, said simply, a lot. Giselle's eyes went wide. Tell me everything. The night ended without incident but not without weight. Hudson helped stack chairs after the event wound down, and Vivian, who had stayed late doing paperwork with the coordinator, came to help. Neither of them planned it. Neither of them walked away. They stacked chairs in almost total silence and it was, somehow, completely fine. When the last chair was done, she said, thank you. He said, it's fine. She said, Hudson. The way she said his name made him stop. He looked at her. I know you're not going to let me in, she said quietly. But I want you to know that I'm genuinely trying. Whatever that's worth to you. He didn't say it was worth a lot. He didn't say it was worth nothing. He said, I'll see you Thursday, the next program day, and walked out. In her car on the way home, Vivian sat with that non-answer for 20 minutes and then decided it was enough. That it was more than enough. That it was the beginning of something. Thursday became a rhythm. Tuesday became another one. The Arts Center became a place where two separate worlds quietly learned to overlap, and while no declaration was made, no line crossed, things were shifting in the way that water shifts stone. Not all at once, but inevitably. It was Daniela who named it first, to Vivian, after one particular Thursday where Vivian had driven an extra 20 minutes out of her way to bring good coffee to the center and then insisted she had to be there anyway. Daniela looked at her and said, you like him. You actually, genuinely like him. Vivian said nothing, which was all the confirmation needed. What none of them had fully reckoned with yet was the complication on Vivian's side that had nothing to do with Hudson's reluctance. Her father's foundation had conditions on the Arts Center funding, soft conditions, not written anywhere, but present. The family had expectations. The world Vivian came from had a very specific template for who she was supposed to end up choosing. Her father had mentioned, casually, the son of a business associate. Mentioned it a second time. The casual repetition was the signature. In Desmond Cho's world, mentioned casually twice, was a sentence. Vivian had smiled and changed the subject. But the subject wasn't gone. Meanwhile, the two friend groups were doing what they always did at the edges of bigger stories. Developing their own parallel dramas with tremendous commitment. Ethan had finally, after extensive internal deliberation, managed to speak to Sanskriti at a community event. A full exchange lasting approximately 3 minutes about a documentary they'd both seen. Sanskriti had returned to Vivian's apartment and told Giselle about it with a composure that lasted about 45 seconds before she put her face in a throw pillow. Giselle had put on music and poured wine and decreed this a full occasion. Daniela had laughed more than she had in weeks. It was a good night. Kibben, when informed of the entire situation, the Ethan Sanskriti development, the Hudson Vivian slow spiral, all of it, was about 70% listening. Yeah, he said, nodding with one earbud in. Good for Ethan though. Then he went back to his music. Julian threw a napkin at him. He caught it without looking up. Jameson had, at some point, agreed to attend one of the community arts events. His text in the group chat had read, "I'm actually definitely going this time." He had then texted the next day, "You guys are never going to let me live this down," but something came up. What had come up was, apparently, a very important nap. Nobody was surprised. The moment things genuinely shifted for Hudson, the moment he stopped simply managing the situation and started actually being in it, happened on a rainy afternoon when he arrived at the arts center to find Vivian there alone, seated on the floor of the main room surrounded by children's artwork, quietly sorting through pieces for a portfolio display. She didn't hear him immediately. He watched her for a moment, longer than he intended. She had her phone propped nearby playing something low and instrumental, and she was holding a small finger-painted piece up to the window light as if it were a museum piece. She looked nothing like the person who had never replied to his messages. She looked real. He stepped in. She looked up, startled, then composed herself. "Oh, I thought I was alone. I have a spare key," he said. "I know," she said. "I was going to leave before everyone arrived." He looked at the floor around her. "You've already organized most of it." A pause. "Yeah," she said. "I've been here a while." He sat down on the floor across from her. He didn't plan to. His body decided before his brain could object. He picked up one of the paintings, a greenhouse with a very round sun, and said, "This one should be in the center of the display." She said, "I know. I put it on the center pile already." He looked at the center pile. She'd been right. He almost smiled. They sorted artwork for an hour. They talked, not about the past, not about the future, but about the paintings. Which child had made which one, what it said about them, what Hudson knew about the kids from his weeks there. She asked questions and he answered them, and somewhere in the middle of it he stopped monitoring himself. It was the ease that undid him, finally. Not the beauty or the pursuit or the money or the apology. The ease, the way a conversation with her had started to feel not like a negotiation but just like talking. He noticed it the same way you notice you've been warm for a while without knowing when the cold stopped. The afternoon ended when the coordinator arrived and was briefly startled to find them both on the floor surrounded by sorted artwork. She recovered quickly and said it was the best organizing job she'd seen in months. Hudson stood and offered Vivian a hand up. She took it. Their hands stayed clasped for exactly 1 second longer than necessary. Neither mentioned it. Outside in the rain, walking to the bus stop, Hudson felt the absence of his defenses like the absence of a code he'd forgotten. He wasn't cold exactly, just aware. He got out his phone and opened Ethan's contact. He typed and deleted something 3 times. Then he typed, "I think I'm in trouble." Ethan replied in under a minute, "Yeah, I know." There was, however, a complication that arrived the following week with the punctuality of something designed to ruin good timing. A man named Harrison, Reeves Harrison, because of course, showed up at the art center. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and he walked toward Vivian with the confidence of someone who had been told she was expecting him. She had not expected him. That was clear from the way she went slightly still. Harrison was the business associate's son her father had mentioned twice over dinner. "He wasn't supposed to be here. Your father told me about the program," he said, smiling. "Thought I'd come see it." Translation: Your father sent me. Hudson watched for about 30 seconds, then turned back to what he was doing with the decisive energy of a man choosing a direction. He helped 2 kids with a watercolor project and did not look back at Vivian and Harrison once. He also counted the number of times he wanted to. It was 7. Vivian wrapped up with Harrison in under 15 minutes and walked him out. When she came back inside, her expression had the careful neutrality of someone managing something. She found Hudson at the table with the kids and sat down beside him without ceremony. "His name is Harrison," she said quietly. "My father keeps pushing him." Hudson said, "You don't have to explain." "But I want to," she said. He finally looked at her. They held eye contact for a beat, not the guarded, calculating kind from earlier weeks, but the kind that happens when walls come down enough to actually see someone. He said, "Okay, just that." She exhaled slowly. It was, somehow, the most they'd said to each other. The story might have progressed gently from there, cautiously, at the pace Hudson needed, if it hadn't been for what happened with Vivian's father the following weekend. Desmond Cho's foundation had a board meeting. At that meeting, one board member raised the question of the Arts Center partnership and whether the community ROI justified the investment. Vivian was brought in to defend the program. She did, confidently, with data, with the stories of specific children and what the program had done for them. She won the vote, but her father spoke to her afterward, alone in his office. He said, "You're over-investing in this." Personally, he wasn't talking about the money. "I'm overseeing a foundation initiative," she said evenly. Her father looked at her the way people with power look when they choose not to use it directly. He said, "Harrison is a good man." She said, "I'm sure he is." He said, "Consider it." She left his office, walked to the elevator, and pressed the button for the lobby 6 times. She didn't tell Hudson any of this. Not directly, but he saw her that Thursday and something in her was tighter than usual, her smile a quarter beat delayed, her laugh less immediately present. He noticed because he had apparently learned her rhythms without permission. He didn't ask, he just made sure to be in the same room as her more often that afternoon. When things were wrapping up, he said, quietly, to her and no one else, "You okay?" She looked at him. She said, "Yeah." He said, "Okay." And then, because he was not totally heartless and apparently was no longer trying to be, "I'm around if not." She didn't say anything, but something in her face went very still and very grateful. That night, she texted him. Not a campaign, not a push, just, "Thank you for asking." He wrote back, of course. 2 words, but she read them approximately 14 times and then made herself put her phone down, which she did successfully for 11 minutes. Hudson put his phone down after sending those 2 words and spent a long time looking at the ceiling. He was not going to be an idiot about this. He was going to be thoughtful and measured and smart. He was going to protect himself. All of these things were still true as he picked his phone back up 20 minutes later and typed, "How are you doing, actually?" Which she answered. They talked until midnight. He asked about her father and she told him, carefully at first, then less carefully, then just honestly, about the pressure that had existed her whole life to be a certain kind of person in a certain kind of relationship with a certain kind of family. He listened without solving. That was rare. She noticed. She said at one point, "Can I ask you something?" He said yes. She said, "What would you have done if I'd replied to your messages back then?" Long pause. He typed, "Probably asked if you wanted to get coffee." She said back, "And now?" He typed, "Now I already know you prefer it black with 1 sugar because you've gotten it 11 times in the same room as me." She didn't reply for 3 minutes. Then, "You counted." He typed back, "Shut up." She sent a laughing emoji. He put his phone down and laughed at his own ceiling for a second, then pressed his hand over his face because apparently they were here now, in this thing, whatever it was, and he didn't know when exactly it had happened. Morning came in with it, immediately. Ethan, who arrived at Hudson's apartment with 2 coffees and a look that said he already knew. "You talked to her last night. How do you know that?" "Because you look like someone who fought themselves and lost." Hudson accepted the coffee. "That's not accurate?" "I was going to say flattering. It's a little accurate though." "Yeah." Kibben arrived an hour later, invited or not, it was difficult to say. He may have heard there was coffee, with both earbuds in. He sat on the couch, pulled one out long enough to hear the summary of the previous night, said, thoughtfully, and put it back in. Then he took it out again. "So you like her?" "Hudson. It's complicated." "Kibben. That's a yes." Earbud back in. They met, actually met, just the 2 of them, by choice, no engineering, on a Saturday afternoon at a small bookshop. Her idea, his agreement. He arrived first, which surprised him. She arrived exactly on time, which surprised him more. She came in wearing something casual, a soft knit top, jeans, flats, and it struck him as the first time he'd seen her without the full weight of the Vivian Cho presentation. They walked the bookshop for 90 minutes. They argued, gently, about whether a certain author's early work was better than the later. They reached agreement on almost nothing, which turned out to be the best conversation he'd had in months. She found a book she hadn't read and he said, "That one's worth it." She bought it. He found one and she said, "I already read it, it's overhyped." He bought it anyway, just to prove her wrong. They got coffee afterward at a place he chose, not hers, not fancy, and sat at a corner table for another hour. At one point she laughed at something he said and it was real, the full version, not the practiced social one, and it did something to the architecture of the afternoon that neither of them commented on. Walking back out, he said, "I want to say something." She stopped on the sidewalk. "The messages," he said. "The not replying. That hurt. Not because I had some enormous expectation. Just because you seemed present. When we talked that first night. Like you were actually there." She held his gaze. She said, "I was. That's what I couldn't figure out." "What do you mean?" He needed her to be more specific. She exhaled slowly. "I was at that party running in a pattern I'd been running for years. Don't stay, don't let anything get complicated. And then you were complicated, in the best way, and I didn't know what to do with that, so I did nothing. Which is the worst thing I could have done." He took that in. He didn't rush to respond. When he finally spoke, he said, "I need you to know that I'm not going to just fold because you're in my space now. I'm going to need this to be real and slow and honest. And if you can't do that, I'd rather know now." She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "I want that too." What followed was not a smooth arc. It was real, which meant it was imperfect and sometimes frustrating and occasionally backward. But it was genuine. They met twice more that week, once by plan, once by the kind of coincidence that stops feeling like coincidence after enough occurrences. Both times, he left feeling fuller than when he'd arrived. On the friend's side, the parallel stories were reaching their own moments. Ethan had finally, after apparently 2 weeks of internal committee deliberation, texted Sanskriti. Not something bold. Just, hey, there's a documentary you mentioned at the event. It's shown this weekend if you wanted to see it. She had replied in under a minute. She had then immediately called Giselle. Giselle had arrived at Sanskriti's apartment in approximately 11 minutes, which was a personal record for her. She brought snacks and a very strong opinion about what Sanskriti should wear, which she delivered with the full conviction of someone who had thought about this scenario in advance. Daniela joined by video call and was equally invested. The documentary date happened. It was good. More than good. Ethan and Sanskriti sat in a theater and afterward walked along the waterfront for an hour talking about the film and then, gradually, about other things, their families, their work, the small details of who they were when the world wasn't watching. He walked her to her car. She sat in it for 10 minutes after he left before driving anywhere. When Ethan told Hudson about it the next day, his composure lasted about as long as Sanskriti's had, which was to say, not long. She laughed at my jokes, Ethan said, quietly, with the expression of someone announcing a miracle. Hudson looked at him from across the room. You're gone, he said. Ethan said, completely. Neither of them seemed bothered by this. And then, the complication. It arrived on a Tuesday in the form of a rumor that traveled from Vivian's father's world into Vivian's world via a phone call she took in the arts center parking lot, pacing in small circles, her voice low and precise. Hudson saw her through the window. He didn't go out. He waited. When she came back in, she looked like someone who had swallowed something they couldn't name. She said nothing about the call. He didn't ask. By now he knew her well enough to know that she would tell him when she was ready and that pressing would only close the door. He trusted the agreement they'd made on the sidewalk, real and slow and honest. He trusted her to keep it. That trust was new and still fragile and it mattered enormously. She told him 3 days later. They were walking along the park path that had become a semi-regular thing on weekend mornings. She'd adopted the habit easily, and he hadn't pointed out that it had originally been his habit with his friends, because she fit into the rhythm of it without effort, which was somehow the most unsettling thing of all. My father is moving to formalize the partnership, the business one, not the foundation one, with Harrison's family, she said. And part of how he's framed it is that I'll be involved. She said the last word carefully. Hudson kept walking, eyes forward. Involved how, he said. She said, in the way that's supposed to look like a relationship. He didn't say anything for a while. They walked. Then, is that what you want? She said, no. Clear, immediate, no performance. He nodded. Another beat. Is it what's going to happen anyway? She said, I don't know yet. And that, he understood, was the most honest thing she could have said. He said, I need you to know something. She stopped walking. He stopped too. He faced her. I'm not going to fight a family business deal for you. I'm not built for that kind of war and I'm not going to pretend I am. She started to speak. But, he said, I'm also not going to make this easier for you by disappearing. I don't want that either. She reached forward and briefly touched his hand, not holding it, just touching it, the way you touch something to confirm it's real. He looked down at her hand, then at her. She said, I'm going to figure this out. He said, okay, that word again, the word they kept returning to, that meant so many things. The pressure from Desmond Cho's world didn't ease. Harrison attended another foundation event, a bigger one, a dinner, held at the Cho family home. Vivian had not told Hudson about it, which he discovered only because Daniela mentioned it to Giselle, who mentioned it to Julian, who told Ethan, who told Hudson, with the delivery of a man who wished he didn't have to. Hudson sat with that for a long time. Then he took out his phone and texted her, how was your night? The answer that came back, fine. How was yours? Was the answer of someone being careful in a way that confirmed what he'd been told. He stared at it, then wrote, you can tell me things, Vivian. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again, then, I know, I'm sorry. The next morning she called him. Not a text. He answered. She explained, the dinner, Harrison being there, the way her father had arranged the room to put them together, and how she'd spent the evening doing everything possible not to give it oxygen. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to feel like you were competing, she said. You're not competing. I know I'm not, he said. But I need you to tell me things anyway. Okay, she said. He heard it land differently when she said it, the weight of his word given back to him. Okay, he exhaled. Okay. They stayed on the phone for another 10 minutes, not saying much, just being there. It was more than enough. Julian, who had been kept updated on everything and who managed to feel strong emotions through the medium of car repair, had fixed 3 engines that week with unusual speed and precision. When Kibben asked why, Julian said, I'm emotionally invested in other people's stories and it makes me very productive. Kibben nodded thoughtfully. He said. Earbud back in. Jameson, contacted for his opinion on the entire Vivian situation, agreed it was wild and also kind of beautiful actually, and then said he was heading to the Arts Center community showcase they'd all been invited to. Absolutely, without question, 100%. He arrived. He was genuinely the last one there. He also brought a very good dessert, which bought him forgiveness. The showcase was the most beautiful the Arts Center had ever looked. The children's work filled every wall, The finger painting from the rainy afternoon Hudson and Vivian had sorted, the watercolors, the collages. Families moved through the space quietly awed. Vivian stood near the center display, Hudson's greenhouse painting exactly where he'd suggested, and watched the families take it all in. Hudson found her there. He stood beside her for a moment, both of them looking at the same wall. He said, quietly, "The greenhouse is perfect there." She said, equally quietly, "I know." He looked at her. She was already looking at him. Neither of them moved apart. They stood there for a long time, both watching the room, shoulders almost touching. It was enough. It was more than enough. Across the room, Ethan and Sanskriti had found each other again, naturally, the way they kept finding each other, both gravitating to the same display, then laughing at the same thing, then slowly moving apart again with the careful choreography of people who have not yet named what they are. Julian saw it and pressed his hand to his heart dramatically. No one was surprised. It was during the end of the showcase that the evening shifted, quietly, from the corner of the room, where Desmond Cho had arrived unannounced. He was not there as the foundation director. He was there as Vivian's father, which was a distinction she read in his posture the moment she saw him come through the door. He moved through the room shaking hands and saying the right things. He was very good at the right things, and he eventually made his way to Vivian. He acknowledged the art genuinely, which was the most disarming thing about him. Then he smiled at Hudson standing beside his daughter and said, "This must be one of the volunteers." Not unkindly, not warmly, categorically. "One of them, yes," Hudson said. His voice was level. Desmond looked at him for a second longer than casual, then turned to Vivian with something said in the architecture of the look, a reminder of the dinner, of Harrison, of the world she came from. Vivian smiled at her father with the precision of someone who has practiced that smile in a mirror for 20 years. It didn't reach her eyes. Desmond stayed for 45 minutes and left with the polished grace of a man who made points without raising his voice. Vivian stood in the doorway watching his car pull away. Hudson appeared beside her. She said, without looking at him, "I'm not letting him dictate this." He said, "I know." She said, "Do you believe me?" He said, "Yes," and he meant it. What followed was the most difficult week either of them had, not because of a fight or a betrayal, but because Vivian had to navigate a formal conversation with her father about Harrison and the business arrangement, and the pressure in that conversation was the kind that bends things. She came out of it quieter. Hudson noticed. He texted her that night, "I'm here." That was the whole text. She held her phone and something in her chest ached with it, the simplicity, the absence of conditions on the offer. She called him. He picked up on the first ring. She didn't say much. He talked about small things. By the end she was laughing and she hadn't seen that coming, and it helped more than anything her father's world could have offered her. And then, the twist. It arrived on a Thursday, in the form of a document that Daniela found by accident, printed and left on the kitchen counter of Vivian's penthouse by someone, a household assistant, most likely, who didn't know its significance. Daniela read it. She sat very still. Then she put it face down and called Giselle. The document was a copy of a contract between the Cho Foundation and the Community Arts Center, the original funding agreement. Daniela had read it before. But this version had something the public version didn't. A clause. A quiet, tucked-away clause. And what it said recontextualized everything. The clause was Desmond Cho's. He had written Vivian's personal involvement into the contract, not as a way of giving her purpose, but as a way of controlling her proximity. The Arts Center's funding was contingent on Vivian's ongoing participation, which meant every moment Vivian had spent there, the volunteering, the coffee, the late evenings sorting artwork, her father had built a structure to make her appear there. A cage designed to look like a cause. But here was the real twist, the one Daniela sat with for a long time before saying it out loud. The clause had been drafted 5 months ago, before Vivian had known Hudson was volunteering there, before any of it, which meant Desmond had placed Vivian at the Arts Center, but not specifically to reach Hudson. He had done it to keep Vivian occupied, structured, and away from things he didn't control. Vivian had not known about the clause. That was the question Daniela had to answer before she did anything else. She asked her directly, sat her down, put the document on the table, and washed her face. Vivian read it. She went very still. Then she said, "I didn't know this was in there." Daniela believed her. And then, "Does that matter?" Vivian said, "It matters to Hudson." She told him herself. She called him that evening and said, "I need to show you something. Can you come over?" He said yes. He'd never been to her apartment before. He arrived to find her in the same soft knit top she'd worn to the bookshop, sitting at the kitchen table with a printed document in front of her, looking like someone who had decided that being honest was more important than protecting herself. She put the document in front of him. She explained it. She told him that she hadn't known, and she told him she couldn't prove it, and she told him she understood if it changed things. She said, "Everything I felt, the coming back, the texts, the Arts Center, that was me. Not this, but I understand if you can't separate them." And then she waited. He read the clause twice. He looked up at her. He said, "Did you feel anything before you knew I was there?" She said, "I felt guilty. About the messages. About ignoring you. That started before the Arts Center." The arts center just gave me a door. He looked at the document again. Something in him settled, not easily, but truly. He said, your father used this to structure your life. That's what he does, isn't it? It wasn't a question. She said, yes. He said, and you didn't know? No. He was quiet for a long time. Then, the clause doesn't change what you felt, or what I felt, but it changes what I think about your father. She said, yeah, me too. Something shifted in the room. He pushed the document to the side, not away, just aside, and said, I'm going to ask you something and I need you to answer it the way you answered me on the sidewalk. She said, okay. He said, did you choose this? Me. This. Did you choose it? She looked at him without flinching. She said, every single time. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Not a grand gesture, just the same quality as the sidewalk touch, confirmed and held this time. She looked down at their hands. She looked back up. He said, okay. One word. Their word. It had changed meaning about 6 times by now and this was the best one yet. What came next was not the end of difficulty. Vivian confronted her father, not in the explosive way dramatic stories sometimes require, but in a quieter, more devastating way. She called a formal foundation meeting, brought legal counsel, and had the personal involvement clause removed from the contract. Cleanly, professionally, in a way her father could not argue with without exposing the clause's manipulative design. Desmond said nothing in the meeting, but afterward, in the lobby, he looked at his daughter for a moment. He said, you're serious about him? Not a question. She said, yes. He looked at her the way parents sometimes look when they realize their children have become someone they didn't program. He said nothing else. He walked out. It was, for Desmond Cho, the loudest surrender she'd ever seen. The Arts Center's funding stayed intact. Vivian renegotiated it to be unconditional and extended. She told Hudson what she'd done. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, you didn't have to do that for me. She said, I did it for the kids. He said, Vivian. She said, and for me. And a little bit for you. He said, good. Harrison was informed by Desmond, not by Vivian, that the arrangement was not proceeding. He took it well, which Daniela reported to Giselle, who reported to Sanskriti, who reported to Vivian, who said, good. Giselle said, that's all you have to say? Vivian said, that's all. Daniela, quietly, smiled. The group, all of them, both worlds, convened in one space for the first time without any agenda except food. When Julian proposed K-barbecue and Kibben responded with the fastest text he'd ever sent in his life. It was a Saturday. Even Jameson came, truly, genuinely, actually on time. He sat down and said, see? I told you I'd make it. No one gave him the satisfaction of pointing out this was the first time. Kibben, despite having both earbuds in for most of the meal, managed to absorb enough of the conversation to make one perfectly timed comment that made the entire table dissolve. He hadn't even looked up. Vivian laughed so hard she had to set down her chopsticks. Hudson looked at her laughing and felt something simple and enormous, ease. Ethan and Sanskriti were seated across from each other, and the electric field between them was visible to anyone with eyes. At one point she reached for the same plate of meat at the same time as him, their hands nearly touching, and both froze for a moment and then talked too quickly about something else. Julian watched this and physically put his face in his hands. Giselle was late by 20 minutes even to a dinner she was already at. She'd stepped out to take a call and come back after everyone had started eating. She slid back into her chair with maximum confidence and zero acknowledgement of the timing and immediately picked up the conversation mid-sentence. This was simply how Giselle existed in the world and it had long since stopped being a point of debate. At the end of the meal, Kibben finally took both earbuds out, fully, both of them, a rare occurrence, looked around the table, and said, this is a good group. Then he put them back in and looked at his phone. Everyone stared at him for a second. Ethan said, that might be the most Kibben has ever said in one sitting. Julian said, don't push it. Kibben, without looking up, I can hear you. Outside the restaurant, afterward, the group dispersed in pairs and clusters into the night. Hudson and Vivian walked together naturally, no announcement, no performance, in the direction of the park they'd made a habit of. She tucked her hand into the crook of his arm without asking. He didn't say anything about it. They walked. He said, walking. You know what I keep thinking about. She said, what? He said, that first night. At the party. You were, actually there. Like I said, you weren't performing at me. You were just there. She said, I remember. He said, I think I knew, even then, that I was going to have a lot of feelings about you and I was right. She stopped walking. He went 2 steps before he noticed and turned. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before, something between grateful and incredulous and deeply moved. She said, you're going to make this very hard to walk away from. He said, that's the general idea. She laughed. He reached back and took her hand properly this time. Ethan, walking home from a different direction, was on the phone with Sanskriti. They'd been on the phone for 20 minutes and had about 40 more to go without either of them fully realizing it, talking about the documentary they'd seen and what they thought and what a second one might look like and when would she be free next week anyway. Sanskriti was on the other end of that call, sitting on her apartment floor in comfortable clothes with the phone held in both hands, laughing at something Ethan just said. Her gold jhumka earrings had been taken off and set on the coffee table. This was who she was when no one was watching, or rather, when the right person was watching. Julian, for his part, had stopped at a late-night taco spot on the way home because he could and because the evening had put him in a celebratory mood. He sat at the counter and ate and felt enormously, irrationally happy about other people's happiness, which was just Julian's way of being in the world. He called it emotional freeloading. Everyone else called it being a good person. Jameson went home and texted the group, "Great night. Doing it again next week? I'm free." Everyone replied immediately to confirm. Jameson said, "I'll be there, 100%. Kibben replied 45 minutes later, "We'll see." For a second the group chat was completely silent. Then Julian sent 17 laughing emojis. Jameson replied, "Okay, fair." Weeks passed. The arts center continued. The funding held, clean and unconditional. The kids painted and collaged and grew, and Hudson showed up every Saturday morning with his canvas tote and his white t-shirt and his glasses, and sometimes Vivian was already there when he arrived, and sometimes she arrived after, and it had long since stopped feeling like anything other than normal. Better than normal. Daniela had, at some point in all of this, quietly become the connective tissue between the two friend groups, someone who moved between them without agenda, who noticed things and said some of them and kept others, who had shown Hudson the document because it was right to, and then stepped back and let the story be theirs. She didn't want credit, she just liked things to be honest. There was one afternoon, a specific Tuesday, the kind that had become significant by accumulation, when Hudson and Vivian were alone at the arts center finishing up after a session. She was reviewing notes at a table and he was at the supply closet, and he said without turning around, "I made a decision." She said, "About what?" He said, "About this. Us. I stopped waiting for it to go wrong." She set her pen down. She said, "When did you decide that?" He said, "I think it was the rainy afternoon with the paintings." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I knew something had changed then. You sat on the floor." "What does sitting on the floor mean?" She smiled. "That you weren't managing me anymore. You were just there." He walked over. Not hurried, he never hurried anymore, didn't need to. He sat on the edge of the table across from her. "I was just there," he said. She said, "Yeah." He said, "That's where I want to be. Just there." She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached up and very deliberately removed his glasses and cleaned them on the edge of her blouse, a small, intimate, entirely ordinary gesture, and put them back on his face. "Better?" she said. "Better," he said. The city moved outside. The arts center held its color and its light. Somewhere across town, Ethan was buying a second ticket to another documentary, and Sanskriti was already texting him about whether she could suggest the place this time, and Kibben was 40 minutes late to something and listening to music with both earbuds in at a crosswalk. And somewhere in all of it, Julian was fixing a car and feeling inexplicably happy. And Jameson was backing out of a commitment while simultaneously making a new one with genuine conviction. And Giselle was arriving somewhere late and making it feel like exactly the right time. And Daniela was reading, quietly, letting the world sort itself. Things were not perfect. They would not be perfect. Desmond Cho's approval was partial and conditional and would take time. There were still hard conversations ahead, about what this looked like when it left the safe space of the arts center and the familiar park paths, about families and futures and the width of the gap between their worlds. But here is what was also true. He knew her coffee order and she knew which kids' paintings he thought were the best and why. She had made him laugh the way only the people closest to you can, from the inside, the deep kind. He had been the one who sat on the floor with her on a rainy afternoon without being asked. These were small things. These were the only things that actually lasted. He had started as someone trying not to be hurt again. She had started as someone too armored to see what was right in front of her. And somewhere between the silences and the texts and the rainy afternoon and the rooftop fundraiser and the document on the kitchen table and the hand taken on the sidewalk, they had met each other, actually met each other, in the realest way. Hudson Chin had decided, once, that if he didn't exist in her world, she wouldn't exist in his. It had seemed like the only logical response to being looked through. What he hadn't accounted for was the possibility that the looking through wasn't the full story, that there was a version of her capable of looking directly, and choosing, and staying. And she had proven it. Not perfectly, not without cost or complication or the long working out of things that began badly. But genuinely, with a voicemail and a chair stacking session and a document placed on a table face up with shaking hands. With every single time, the city kept moving, the group kept gathering, the K-barbecue kept happening, with Kibben always arriving late and always having the most incisive thing to say from behind his earbuds, with Julian always laughing too loudly and meaning it completely, with Jameson always promising and occasionally delivering and always, somehow, being forgiven. The greenhouse painting still hangs in the center of the arts center display. The child who made it comes back sometimes on Saturdays. She's moved up to watercolor now, more confident, bigger brushstrokes. Hudson tells her it's good. She says she knows. He laughs. Across the room, Vivian looks up from her notes. She catches the laugh. She keeps it. This was the story of a boy who decided to stop being hurt by learning to stop caring, and a girl who realized, too late, and then just in time, that she had cared from the beginning and hadn't known what to do with it. It was the story of two friend groups who would, slowly, become one. It was a lot of things. It was mostly true.